Hello everyone and welcome to the 1.10 lesson Demanding a Voice. And this one is going to be about the women's rights movement and the struggle for women's suffrage. And suffrage in this case of course means voting, the right to vote. Not suffrage as in suffering and being sad and being persecuted, but of course in a way not being allowed to vote is of course making sad and is a form of persecution. So I guess it is kind of fitting. But do note that when we talk about women's suffrage, we're talking about the right to vote. Okay, let's begin lesson 1.12. At the turn of the century, African Americans were not the only citizens denied full citizenship. American women also experienced discrimination, especially in the political process. After the historic meeting in Seneca Falls in 1848, more and more people took part in the suffrage movement to secure voting rights for American women. The leaders of the suffrage movement had both resourcefulness and tenacity. And remember the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. That's where the Declaration of Sentiments was written, which was written similar to the Declaration of Independence, but it listed the rights that women had been asking for and deserving for, was the Declaration of Sentiments, and one of those rights in the Declaration of Sentiments was the right to vote. Goals for this lesson: describe discrimination against women at the turn of the 20th century, describe the ratification of the 19th Amendment, and recognize key events and leaders in the women's suffrage movement. Don't forget to go to lesson resources, grab your reading guide and/or your lesson answer key, and also note there's another document called Women's Suffrage that you'll be using as well. So grab those items and then let's begin. We're going to start reading pages 598 through 605. So let's go to the textbook and start here, the rights of women. And let's look at the picture before we begin. Women's rights advocates split into two camps, the more radical of which was the National Women's Suffrage Association. So we're going to read about those two groups here in the lesson. In 1848, at a historic meeting in Seneca Falls, New York, Elizabeth Cady Stanton declared that all women and men are created equal. From that time on, thousands and then tens of thousands of people joined the movement for women's rights. They focused much of their attention on women's suffrage, securing voting rights for women. But they also worked to end various forms of discrimination against women and to open opportunities long closed to them. The domestic and the public sphere. In the mid-19th century America, not only were women barred from voting, but once they got married, they lost most of their property rights. Whatever a woman owned became the property of her husband. Most women couldn't attend college, and those who entered the workforce encountered low pay and few opportunities for advancement. The mid-19th century attitude towards women can be summed up in the cliché, "A woman's place is in the home." Most Americans of the time unquestionably accepted the idea of separate spheres of activity for men and women. By this reasoning, a woman belonged in the domestic sphere. Her true calling in life was to provide a moral upbringing for her children and to furnish her husband with a warm and nurturing home. The rough and tumble public sphere of work and politics was reserved for men. Many, if not most women, shared this idea of separate spheres, which made the work of women's rights advocates all the more challenging. In the decades following the Civil War, as the nation grew more urbanized and more industrialized, women's lives began to change. More women started attending college, while many others joined the industrial workforce. Many women who stayed at home felt a longing to get involved in the public sphere. Women moved beyond the domestic sphere by forming hundreds of religious and charitable organizations, as well as literary societies and arts clubs. In these groups, women did more than share their interests and experiences. By planning and carrying out projects, electing their own officers, writing reports, and speaking in public, they gained valuable experience outside the home. That experience would soon be put to use in the struggle for women's rights. Let's quickly read through this part in blue before we begin the next section. Higher education for women. At the time of the Civil War, most colleges admitted only men. Women seeking higher education were mainly limited to seminaries designed to train school teachers, one of the only professions considered socially acceptable for women at the time. In 1861, Vassar College opened in Poughkeepsie, New York, with the aim of offering women an education comparable to that available at the best men's colleges. As the influence of the women's rights movement spread, more women began to demand equal educational opportunities. Other women's colleges were founded, offering programs with high academic standards, including Bryn Mawr in Pennsylvania, and in Massachusetts, Wellesley College and Smith College. By 1900, more than a third of all college students were women. Getting organized. From the beginning, women's rights activists in the United States disagreed among themselves on strategy and tactics. What was the best way for women to win the vote? Who should be allowed to take part in the movement? Men as well as women? Should women devote themselves exclusively to gaining the right to vote or also pursue other reforms? By 1869, disagreements over these issues led women's rights advocates to split into two separate camps. The National Women's Suffrage Association, the NWSA, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, was the more radical of the two. The NWSA barred men from membership and called this newspaper the Revolution. They demanded the immediate passage of a federal law granting women's full voting rights. Leaders of the NWSA, many of whom had been active in the abolitionist movement, grounded their demands for women's equality in the language of the Declaration of Independence. They argued that men and women, blacks and whites, were endowed with the same human rights. As such, they said, the law should make no distinctions between them. The NWSA rival organization, the American Women's Suffrage Association, the AWSA, took a more moderate approach. Led by Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe, the AWSA welcomed men as members and sought to gain women's suffrage at the state and local rather than the national level. At first, neither the NWSA nor the AWSA was able to make much headway. Hoping to revive their flagging campaign for women's suffrage, the two groups merged in 1890 and formed the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the NAWSA. The NAWSA benefited not only from changing times, but also from a new generation of leaders. For example, Carrie Chapman Catt led a successful suffrage campaign in Colorado. Catt served as president of the NAWSA from 1900 to 1904 and from 1915 to 1920. Recognizing that each part of the country had its own unique political circumstances, Catt developed a flexible, state-by-state strategy. In some states, she instructed activists to limit their efforts to passing laws that would allow women to vote, only in U.S. presidential elections. In other states, she told staff members and volunteers to campaign for full voting rights in all elections, municipal, state, or federal. To conserve resources, Catt ended efforts in those states where chances of success seemed remote. The reorganization energized the campaign for women's suffrage. By 1917, the NAWSA had enrolled more than 2 million members. Susan B. Anthony on trial. Let's read this section here. As the presidential election of 1872 approached, Susan B. Anthony was determined to cast a vote. With her sister, she entered a voter registration center in Rochester, New York. She demanded to be registered as a voter. When the officials refused, she threatened to sue them. She argued the 14th Amendment, which forbids states from making laws to abridge the privileges of citizens, would be upheld in court as proof of her right to vote. The officials, more intimidated than persuaded, registered as a voter. On election day, Susan B. Anthony and a few other women cast their votes for president. 2 weeks later, they were arrested for casting illegal ballots. At her trial, the judge found Susan B. Anthony guilty. Before pronouncing the sentence, the judge asked Anthony if she had anything to say. Anthony responded with a stirring speech. There are varying accounts of her response. The following excerpts are from a document that Anthony prepared and distributed in 1874, an account of the proceedings on the trial of Susan B. Anthony and the charge of illegal voting. And I'm just going to read Miss Anthony's section. Yes, Your Honor, I have many things to say, for in your ordered verdict of guilty you have trampled underfoot every vital principle of our government. My natural rights, my civil rights, my political rights, my judicial rights, all alike are ignored. Robbed of the fundamental privilege of citizenship, I am degraded from the status of a citizen to that of a subject. And not only myself individually, but all of my sex are by your Honor's verdict doomed to political subjection under this so-called form of government. Your denial of my citizen's right to vote is the denial of my right of consent as one of the governed, my denial of my right of representation as one of the taxed, the denial of my sacred rights to life, liberty, and property. All right, let's read Breakthrough in the West. Out west, far from Washington, D.C., the suffrage campaign achieved its first successes. In the West, the line separating women's and men's spheres was less clearly defined than in other parts of the nation. On farms and homesteads, women joined their husbands in the hard work of planting, harvesting, tending animals, and more. If they could share the work with men, then why then should they share the right to vote as well? In the mountainous parts of the West, there were relatively few women. Hoping to attract more female settlers, the territory of Wyoming established full voting rights for women in 1869. The Utah and Washington territories followed, and by 1893, women in Colorado could vote as well. Western women soon started running for public office, winning numerous local elections. In 1916, Montana voters elected Jeannette Rankin to the U.S. House of Representatives, where she became the first woman in Congress. And you can see there's more of that excerpt of that Susan B. Anthony and the judge. I didn't read it all, obviously, but you can certainly look through that. Suffragists make progress. As more women joined the workforce and attended college, more of them joined the ranks of state and local suffrage groups. With new energy, new ideas, and organizational experience gained as members of women's clubs and voluntary organizations, the rising generation of suffragists went to work. And let's just read this caption. Wearing academic robes and bearing banners identifying their colleges, women marched for the right to vote in 1910. So you see Wellesley College, Radcliffe. Can't quite read the next ones, but you see that showing that they're educated, they are informed, and they should have the right to vote. By 1912, women won state-level suffrage campaigns in Washington, California, Oregon, Kansas, and Arizona. Suffragists employed new tactics. They canvassed door-to-door, held nighttime torchlit parades, and spoke to crowds at suburban streetcar stops. In 1913, the suffragists achieved a major breakthrough when Illinois women won the right to vote, though only in presidential elections. Despite the limitations of Illinois' new law, for the first time, women's rights activists had won a political victory in a state east of the Mississippi River. Arguing for the vote. Arguments for women's suffrage varied widely. Far from attacking the idea of separate spheres for men and women, many suffragists supported it. They insisted that, now more than ever, women needed the right to vote to enhance their ability to be good wives and mothers. They argued that in the new, industrialized landscape of modern America, women needed to be politically active in order to be responsible caretakers of the home. Jane Addams adopted this line of reasoning in her 1910 essay, Why Women Should Vote. She wrote, "In a crowded city quarter, if the street is not cleaned by the city authorities, no amount of private sweeping will keep the tenement free from grime. If the garbage is not properly collected and destroyed, a tenement house mother may see her children sicken and die of disease. Other dangers, such as improperly inspected food, could threaten the home, while saloons could compromise urban neighborhoods. Such problems," said Addams, "required political remedies. Thus, unless women had some control over their politicians, they could not properly execute their responsibilities as mothers and wives. To fulfill her traditional responsibility to her children," Addams concluded, "a woman must bring herself to the use of the ballot." Some arguments for suffrage were less inclusive. White activists in the South argued that women's suffrage was a way to protect white supremacy, since there were more white women in the southern states than black men and women combined. In the North, some suffragists claimed that by giving native-born white women the vote, states could counter the foreign menace of immigrant voting. Clearly, in the ever-growing suffrage movement, not everyone saw eye to eye. Alice Paul, militant suffragist. But let's look here at this map. It's titled State by State Women's Suffrage Before the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment was the constitutional amendment that guaranteed women the right to vote. So before that amendment, these were the states that had equal suffrage. The ones in red had equal suffrage, and then parentheses, the year adopted. The yellow ones have partial women's suffrage, which we can see Minnesota had partial women's suffrage, and the green had no statewide women's suffrage. Okay, get to the reading then. Here's a picture of Alice Paul, 1915. Suffragists disagreed on strategy and tactics. Unhappy with the gradual state-by-state focus of the NAWSA, in 1913 a group of activists led by Alice Paul, a young Quaker from New Jersey, founded the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, later called the National Women's Party. Paul had recently returned from England, where she took part in a radical women's suffrage movement led by Emmeline Parkhurst, whose motto was "Deeds, not words." Pankhurst and her colleagues held hunger strikes, pelted politicians with eggs, and broke into meetings of Parliament. Under Alice Paul's leadership, the National Women's Party called for a constitutional amendment giving women the right to vote. They used the militant, though nonviolent tactics that Paul had learned in England. When Paul led a picket line in front of the White House, she and her fellow marchers were assaulted by bystanders, beaten by the police, and hauled off to jail. In the cold and filthy prison, Paul and other suffragists staged a hunger strike, which the jailers tried to end through brutal force feeding. And I do have a video that I'm going to show in a Class Connect about that. When the press published accounts of the mistreatment of the suffragists, Paul and others were released, and the publicity won new support for the cause of women's suffrage. Okay, I'm going to end this video here because we're almost up to our 15-minute time limit, so be sure to watch part 2 for the rest of the reading and the other parts of the lesson.